So, I'm watching part two of this Russian report here. It's focusing on what they're calling a domino effect across central Russia to explain the nature of Russia's authoritarianism. This strikes me as a kind of a wishful thinking by the Pentagon. Um, the truth is that those um, conflicts that exist in these areas are mostly pushed by foreign interests, chief amongst them being the United States. It's not to say that there aren't legitimate concerns, but people don't generally focus their like. If you can find me an example of a legitimate separatist movement like this, I don't think there's ever been one. Like the whole concept of separatism is broadly nonsense. I think probably the closest. I mean, you've got like Quebec or Scotland, and even Scotland is political, and even to an extent Quebec is political, because the United States may want to use that to break the country up, and arguably has in the past. Um, there's not really any kind of good example of this. That's outside of a colonial context, and trying to put what happens in Russia in a colonial context is um, disingenuous, let us say. Um, so the domino theory is, like all domino theories, is nonsense. And I don't think really there's anybody that actually believes that, except for some military strategists in the CIA, which kind of suggests where this analysis is ultimately coming from. Um, the why do they need authoritarianism in Russia? Because it's a huge country. um, it's and let's not exaggerate the idea of authoritarianism in Russia so much. It's not like Putinism is not Stalinism. It's just it's a Western democracy. Um, they have elections. It's just the biggest problem in Russia. I've been over this on other places. The biggest problem in Russia is actually the lack of a spectrum. Um, this is what a lot of outside observers don't really get. The political spectrum in Russia is that you can have Putin or you can have the communists. Um, the opposition party is still the communists, and when we talk about communists in Russia, we're not talking about like it's not Bernie Sanders. Like it's like these are the communists, the Soviets. So the party from the Soviet Union. I mean, it was never outlawed. It never ceased to exist. It's just been in opposition for, I guess, 30 years now. Um, or close to 30 years, anyways. 25, anyways. So I mean, like, there's no opposition. And the only real third parties that exist are in the forms of like extreme national. They call themselves liberals, but they're closer to fascists. So you're a Russian and you show up to vote. Well, you can vote for the communists or the fascists or Putin. Well, Putin might not be your favorite guy in the world, but he's better than the communists and he's better than the fascists. So I guess we're gonna go with that. What is he actually? He's a conservative. He's a Russian conservative. But his party is it's a coalition, a grand coalition, if you will, of what would pass for liberals and conservatives in a country like Canada. So, um, or in the United States, if you could imagine in the United States the Democrats and Republicans merging into one party. That might not be so hard to imagine, but if you could imagine that, that would be what Putin is. He's the one party guy, um, and but in order to make sense to put that in a context, you have to imagine that there's a huge communist movement, um, and nothing else. Um, the Western media wants to focus on these these liberal quote unquote protesters. Well, like I say, number one, they don't fit any concept of liberalism that the West understands, and number two, like they can't get 5% in the polls. Um, and we can forget about this idea. I mean, all of the all of the. I don't want to say that the elections are free and fair, but I don't think that elections in the United States are free and fair either. Right? So, comparatively speaking, I don't think we're looking at anything worse, and I don't think the outcomes of the election are significantly different than what the people are actually voting for. Minus, a few, you know, rigged polls here and there designed to, get a point across. I mean, it's a ruling party. All ruling parties, manipulate polling places. I'm not naive about this, right? So, um, I'm not going to pretend that it's perfect there, but I mean, I'm not going to pretend it's perfect anywhere else either. So, this concept of Russian authoritarianism is, I mean, it's historically rooted, um, but it's largely blown out of proportion. I've compared I've compared Putin in the past to Churchill, in the sense that he's kind of a last stand, on a Russian empire that's about to implode. Um, Trying to reassert something that is probably largely historical, and politically speaking is roughly in that space. Churchill, Bismarck, and the fact that that was 100 years ago is kind of indicative as to where Russia is in its terms of development. That's the big problem with Russia. Okay, it's not the form of government that they have; it's the fact that they're 100 years behind us. Uh, and to have Russia really um, integrate is well, to have Russia integrate is going to require a big change of attitudes. Um, in Washington, first and foremost, but secondly, the massive technological development. Um, Russia is not at the same level of social development as we are, and there's no use pretending that they are. And it's not going to get us anywhere pretending that they are. They are 100 years behind us, and their political system is reflective of that. So, that's what they have. They have a guy in power that has policies that are similar to Churchill or Bismarck. Um, and that's just where they are in their development. So what do we need to explain authoritarianism in Russia? Well, nothing, because to begin with, it's not really there, and second of all, it's just a function of the spectrum. The domino theory that they're presenting is, if somebody in Chechnya manages to pull something off, if anything, the more empirical observation of what we're seeing is that it would create us kind of a groundswell of Russian nationalism. The support would probably behind the president would increase if he was strong enough to take it down, kind of thing. Um, this idea of a separatist ideology in Russia is not actually there. It's wishful thinking by the Pentagon. Something else that they're trying to argue here is the idea that the historical Russian desire for a warm water port is beyond its possible. It's not really worth seriously considering, is really what they're saying. Um, I think that that might be a big part of the reason that the Russians are so buddy buddy with Iran. Um, and that's probably their best chance. Of course, outside of um, trying to find a way to hold control of the uh, base in Syria, um, which of course is a big part of what the conflict in Syria is about, and the conflict in Libya was about. So they are kind of missing a little bit of evidence there. There was a warm water port in Libya, and there is one in Syria, but these are outside of the Russian mainland proper, right? So they have to act as transit points, and they can't really. The Russians can leave, like military stuff there, but it doesn't really help in terms of increasing trade, which is the whole point, right? So you want to have a warm water port so that you can increase your trade abilities, and then you need um, the cruise ships to protect the commercial vessels, right? Commercial vessels without military vessels without commercial vessels is pointless. Um, So I mean that's the thing, right? But I mean they do have that network, and if they could find a way to integrate one of those ports, they'd be laughing. The big problem with Iran, of course, is that they're on the Persian Gulf, and the Americans are kind of invested in the Persian Gulf, as they are in the Black Sea. This is, um, I mean, it's the issue all the way around, right? It's the containment issue. Um, One other thing to point out about that, though, besides the Iran thing, and the Iran thing probably is something to watch for, um, even if it's kind of more pushing towards the Iran-India border than it is, right in the Gulf. That's a corridor that, well, I mean, I think America's burnt its bridges with Iran pretty badly. It's hard to see how there's going to be any kind of legitimate cooperation with Iran for any time in the foreseeable future. So the idea of the Russians being able to build kind of like a safe corridor through Iran is probably less infeasible than one might think. And as is the case with so much of what Russia has been able to do over the last 2 years or so, it's rooted in a failure of American policy. America has made some really bad choices over the last 10 years. And Obama has been, worse than Bush in a lot of ways, in making really strategic errors. Um, really bad strategic errors that are going to harm them. And this whole idea of isolating and harming, they tried to, like the sanctions against Iran, like the kids dying, and Iran is not going to go out of its way to do anything for America. And if the Russians want to, um, ship some medicine in exchange for a safe corridor for goods, I think the Iranians will be happy to oblige. So there's that. But the other thing to keep in mind is that we are dealing with a warming climate. So just how good are those ports going to be in the Far East? But I mean, I think the issue in the eastern part of Russia is less that it's accessible. I mean, they've got open access, but it's more that like around Vladivostok, total open access. There's no real issue there. It's more that it's so far that it defeats the point. Um, you send something in. Well, I mean, first of all, where are you sending it in from? And second of all, once you do send it in, um, you're sending it across the entire landmass of Asia. The whole point is to reduce transportation costs. It doesn't really make any sense, right? But I mean, it's still something to keep in mind um, as that opens up. That that rail system across Asia is it is the thing that will decide whether Eurasia becomes European or Chinese dominated. Um, it's hard to see how Russia and China, in the broader size of things, can avoid integration um, within the context of a functioning rail line. I know that sounds very 19th century, and maybe it is, but it is still absolutely true. The North American continent is widely understood to have coalesced into nation states and national identities because of the rail that was built. I cannot see how one can build railways from Beijing to Moscow across a wide expanse, of Asia, its whole Iranian, Turkish, Mongolian, Chinese space, and not have it become an insular power of itself. It's hard to see how you could come up with anything besides the resurrection of the Mongolian Empire. It's just a question of whether that empire places its capital in Moscow or Beijing, and that's so key. I say this a lot. Westerners tend to misunderstand World War II. World War II was a conflict between Germany and Russia. And it was a conflict that the Russians won, but were not able to complete their victory in because the Americans saved the Germans from total defeat at the hands of the Russians. World War III, despite everything that's happening, World War III will be a conflict between Russia and China for dominance over Eurasia. You're looking at superior Chinese finances and technology and political systems and everything else against the sheer size of Russia, which is very similar, actually, to the conflict happened on the other side of the landmass, 75 years ago. But yeah, the warm water ports. I don't think. I don't think that Russia's increasing cooperation with Iran is happening in a bubble in regarding the context of these warm water ports that Russia has indeed been quite interested in for quite a long time. Almost 6 o'clock, and it's not dark yet. This is good. This is good. It's still cold out. You can't tell quite so much as you could before. Although the fact that the snow has not melted should be broadly suggestive of the temperature there. We actually had some record cold temperatures. Not exactly here, but in Toronto, which is not far from here, over the weekend. It was cold here, but not ridiculous. We didn't quite hit minus 20, and it doesn't look like we're going to. In fact, it looks like we might get another brief dip on Tuesday night, but it looks like we've got spring rolling in here. We'll see. The way that the way that winter's been running over the last couple of years is that it's not it's the sort of background temperature is actually fairly pleasant, but we get these nasty dips of cold air blowing down, right? So those are hard to predict too far ahead of time. Um, or at least not precisely. The weather gurus there can get patterns and stuff, but the exact extent of things depends on how other things are playing out. So you can look at the amount of solar energy. I need to be careful on this topic because so much discussion has been had from people that very, very badly abuse um, the idea of changes in solar energy hitting the Earth. Um, it is actually widely understood, and this is accepted science, and I say that not from a climate quote unquote skeptic perspective. I say this from a very standard meteorological perspective. There's studies. If you ask experts, they will uphold this. It is well understood that the polar vortex is positively correlated with the solar cycle. The idea is that the amount of energy in the atmosphere changes, and that has an effect on how wide the vortex blows up, right? So what causes the vortex? The vortex it happens every winter, and it's caused by a decrease in solar energy. That's why we have a polar vortex, because of the Earth's rotation, tilt, and everything else. It's winter. Why do we have winter? We have winter because we get less sunlight. Why do we have a polar vortex? We have a polar vortex because we get less sunlight. And when we have especially less sunlight, the strength of the vortex increases. And it becomes bigger and bigger and bigger, and everything else. If we were to go through a really serious decrease in solar energy, or we were to get knocked out of orbit, or if some large star decided it was going to float by at a distance from us and yank us out of orbit, like a magnet running over, filings, iron filings. It's an interesting thought. Imagine a magnet running over iron filings. I now consider that like our planet is the filing as a huge astronomical object that floats by, right? Something like that happens, and we get like perturbed out of orbit. And I should point out that is not crazy talk. The best that we can do with the n-body problem is conclude that we don't have enough data, man. We cannot solve the orbit of the planets in our solar system solely with the solar system. There's other forces, random ones, in fact, or ones that appear random to us because we only have a limited view of what's actually around us. But the idea of a giant planet, moving into our gravitational sphere, not only is it not crazy, it's almost certain. So if you can imagine that, and all of a sudden, we're that much further from the sun, the tilt on the Earth gets warped however further much, so that we're spinning even more wobbly, or whatever else. It could set us into an ice age. And this old guy named Milankovitch had something to say about that. But what I'm getting at, if we can, I didn't really need to have a lecture about perturbation theory here. Milankovitch theory. I just wanted to point out that if the Earth happened to be knocked off a little bit, then the polar vortex would grow. That's what causes it to happen. So when we see decreases in solar energy, it makes perfect sense for the vortex to grow larger because there's less solar energy. That's actually how the process works. So, these solar energy people, well, no, solar energy is a good idea. You should get panels. But the solar insulation theory of global warming is, of course, nonsense. There's not enough energy involved to see a global-wide increase or decrease. However, the idea that changes in solar output are very strongly connected to the widening of the vortex and consequently the waviness of the jet stream is very well understood. So in summer, what ends up happening is, so you get this vortex running around the North Pole, and in summer it gets smaller and smaller because there's more sunlight. In winter it gets bigger because there's less sunlight, and if you have, a period where you have an especially low amount of sunlight, then you get, these these kinds of waves coming down, and it's. I think a part of the part of understanding it is realizing that we're perceiving it backwards, right? Because we're in the stasis of warmth, so we perceive of the vortex growing, right? When in fact what's actually happening is that the amount of heat is decreasing, right? So we don't have more cold. What we actually have is less heat. That's a thermodynamic reality, right? You always have. I mean, the idea of more cold is kind of. I mean, it's colloquial. We talk about this. Even the weather people, they talk about this, but it actually is meaningless. You cannot have more cold. The idea of the mere concept of more cold actually means less heat. So when we talk about the vortex growing, that's not actually what's happening. What's happening is the amount of heat in the atmosphere is decreasing, and it's decreasing because of the lack of sun, right? So the energy required to keep the cold kind of bottled in is lessening rather than the size of the vortex is increasing. Although it's they're equal and opposite concepts, and you can talk about it equivalently, and maybe it makes more sense for us, but from a physical perspective, it's not a growing vortex. It's decreasing energy, right? So all of that to say that it's really hard to know what it is that's like when these cold snaps are gonna float down. Or we should say, it's hard to know when we're going to lose the southerly flow of heat, which allows what is actually the natural condition of heatlessness, of cold, to assert itself. Like I said, we can look at the patterns and say, okay, well, right now we're in a period of very low solar activity. Because we're in a period of very low solar activity, we would expect cold snaps when they happen to be very nasty, which is what we've seen over the last couple of years. This year, it was a little bit muted for other reasons, but we've seen, like in February, we have seen some pretty nasty cold snaps. Like I say, record temperatures over the weekend. Nothing like last year or the year before in terms of length. Like, we're not getting these long periods, but we broke records here over the last couple of days. It was very cold, and so we can look at the situation and we can predict that. What's harder to predict is, or from a distance is harder to predict, are things like El Nino, right? So it's not as though you have to answer the question of which of these things is dominating the climate. And that's the error that these so-called climate skeptics make. They want to force you to choose between, the sun having an effect on the weather and, the atmosphere having an effect on the weather. And they get otherwise intelligent people stuck in these ridiculous arguments. It really should not require such depth of thought to take a step back and say, wait a second, why are we making this choice? Is it not as abundantly obvious as could possibly be that both the sun and the atmosphere have an effect on the weather? And in fact, if they're moving in if the factors are contradicting itself, then they're going to be in conflict with each other. And that's what we've seen here this winter. We've seen lots of warm air coming up from the south. And you can talk about the decadal oscillations and everything else. And the El Nino and all these sorts of things, but the reality is that there's a lot of heat being trapped in the ocean, and it's coming out. So why do we have this really, really hot El Nino? That's global warming, okay? And that's easily understood, that's easily deconstructed. That's an increase of carbon in the atmosphere. So we have these huge amounts of warm air coming up from the south because we're putting too much carbon in the atmosphere. So that's one thing that's happening, right? And we saw that this winter very clearly. It was record warmth for long periods. This is really it's Valentine's Day, which I don't give a fuck about at all. I didn't even mention it, and let's just leave it at that. So I mean, and this is the first snap of actual winter that we got really serious, like really serious winter, right? So we saw lots of warm air coming up from the south. That's global warming. But we also saw decreases in energy, which allowed the absence of warm air. See, this is why we speak colloquially about cold air coming down, even though that doesn't make any sense. It's because it's hard to articulate. Our language doesn't really provide for the proper way to talk about this. We saw that as a decrease in solar energy. So we saw both of these things happening, and we can see the consequences of both of them happening. So, why are we having this discussion? Why are we having a debate as to pick one or the other? You couldn't explain the weather unless you understood both of these things happening, because they're happening against each other, and they're fighting against each other. Now, that's something that's only been happening for a couple of years. It's extremely instructive, and I so hope that activists pick that up, and they say, okay, look, we got both of these things happening. We can explain it by pointing out they're both happening at the same time. If you look at the 90s, it was that we had peaks in solar insolation at the same time as we had, the consequences of global warming. So both of these things were happening at the same time, and everybody was, we ended up stuck in this false dichotomy where we had to pick one or the other. I think that it's clear in hindsight that we can look at that and say, okay, in fact, both of these things were happening and they were reinforcing each other. Now we're in a phase where they're acting against each other, and we can see the consequence of it. Record warmth and record cold in the same season, oscillating back and forth as one phenomena overpowers the other. Synthesis. This is how we move forward. We have a thesis, we have an antithesis, and then we synthesize them. And my battery's out, so I guess I'll have to leave it at that. So things to throw into the garbage after eating. I've got a paper towel. I dropped some
Well, I picked up some plates and there was more water on it than I thought, and it ended up on the floor. So I was using a paper towel because my socks were a little bit overdone. Um, I'm not currently wearing socks. And this is the top of a margarine container. I'd like to pretend I could recycle it, but I know I can't. So, some more garbage.